After a tense night in the ranger's cabin, I finally felt a sliver of hope. Using the map I found inside, I plotted a safe route out of the mountains, avoiding main trails and areas where the intruders could follow. The journey down was exhausting. My arms and legs ached, and every step was calculated to avoid loose rocks or hidden pitfalls. But with each passing hour, the valley opened up more, and the golden sunlight of dawn bathed the mountains in warmth. Finally, I reached a small town at the foot of the mountains. The streets were quiet in the early morning, and I allowed myself to breathe freely for the first time in days. The gemstone, still clutched in my hand, gleamed in the sunlight, a reminder of every risk I had taken. I contacted a trusted jeweler in town, carefully showing him the stone. His eyes widened. "This is extraordinary," he said, examining it with a loupe. This could change your life." In that moment, I realized it already had. The journey had tested my courage, resourcefulness, and determination. I had faced danger, uncertainty, and fear, and come out the other side. The treasure wasn't just the gemstone. It was the experience, the survival, and the knowledge that I had pushed myself to limits I didn't know I had. As I walked through the town, the sun rising behind the mountains, I knew my life had changed forever. The adventure was over, but the story, and the lessons, would stay with me for a lifetime. The treasure had been found. And I had found myself along the way. The end. I emerged from the canyon just as the last rays of sunlight vanished behind the peaks. The valley stretched before me, peaceful and quiet, a sharp contrast to the chaos inside the cave. I sank to the ground, exhausted, my hands still clutching the gemstone. I thought I was finally safe. But then, a glint caught my eye. Across the clearing, partially hidden in the grass, was a small metallic object reflecting the moonlight. My heart sank. It was a tracking device, no doubt left by the intruders. I realized the journey wasn't just about survival anymore. Someone could follow me, could take the treasure, could ruin everything. I needed to act fast. Using my knowledge of the terrain and the journal's tips, I carefully moved through the trees, avoiding the main paths. Hours passed, and the forest seemed endless. Just when fatigue threatened to overcome me, I stumbled upon an old ranger's cabin. The door was ajar, the smell of wood smoke lingering. I ducked inside, shutting the door behind me. Inside, there was a small supply of food, blankets, and most importantly, a map of the area. For the first time, I felt like I had allies, or at least a safe place to plan my next move. I laid out the gemstone, examining it under the dim lantern light. It was real. The treasure was real. But with it came responsibility and danger. The journey had tested me in ways I hadn't imagined, and the final challenge was still ahead, getting the wealth safely out of these mountains. I moved as quietly as possible, clutching the single gemstone in my hand. The tunnel twisted and turned, and every echo of my own steps made me flinch. The intruder was somewhere behind me, his frustrated shouts bouncing off the walls. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a narrow canyon. I had to make a choice, risk climbing the slippery rocks or try to find another hidden path. My legs trembled, but I scrambled up the jagged stones, keeping low, using the shadows to my advantage. From above, a shout pierced the air. One of the men had spotted me. Rocks tumbled down as he tried to follow. I ducked behind a boulder, my heart racing, barely daring to breathe. The canyon twisted again, and I spotted a natural rope of vines dangling from an overhang. It was my only chance. I grabbed it, swinging over a steep drop to the other side. My hands scraped raw, my muscles burned, but I landed safely. The intruders weren't as lucky. One slipped, catching himself on the rocks, while the other hesitated, unsure of how to follow. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran, finally leaving the echoing canyon behind. By sunset, I found a small clearing overlooking the river below. My hands were bleeding, my clothes torn, but I had survived. And I still had the gemstone, a small reminder that fortune favors the brave. For the first time, I allowed myself to breathe. But I knew the intruders might regroup. The journey wasn't over. After crawling through the narrow fissure, I emerged into a chamber unlike anything I had seen before. The walls sparkled with veins of gemstones, but what caught my breath was a small alcove at the far end. Inside, dozens of fully formed, large gemstones rested in natural stone holders. Diamonds, sapphires, emeralds, and a few crystals that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. I sank to my knees, overwhelmed. This wasn't just a find, it was a fortune beyond imagination. But with the wealth came a gnawing fear. The intruders were still somewhere behind me. I had escaped them once, but I couldn't be sure they wouldn't track me here. I examined the largest gemstone. Its blue-green hue seemed to pulsate slightly, almost like it had a life of its own. I reached out, and then paused. Could I take it? Should I? The journal's warnings echoed in my mind. The greedy shall never leave. Suddenly, a noise behind me made me spin around. One of the intruders had found this chamber too. His eyes widened at the sight of the treasure, but he hadn't noticed me crouching in the shadows. I realized I had a choice: confront him, risk everything, or find another exit and take only what I could safely carry. My heart hammered. This was the ultimate test: courage, wisdom, and survival all tangled in one moment. I took a deep breath, clutched a single gemstone, and silently slipped into the narrow tunnel on the side, hoping the intruder wouldn't notice. For now, I had a treasure in hand, but the real challenge was getting out alive. The tremor grew stronger. Pebbles bounced across the cavern floor, and dust fell from the ceiling. My heart pounded. This was no minor shake. Something in the chamber was unstable. I realized that some of the gemstones were embedded in loose rock, and shifting even slightly could trigger a small collapse. I needed to move carefully, or all of this could come crashing down. As I inched forward, my flashlight caught movement at the edge of the cavern. Two shadows, yes, the intruders had somehow found their way in. They didn't see me yet, but I knew I had little time. One of them shouted, and rocks clattered underfoot. My mind raced. I could confront them, but I was outnumbered. I could run, but the tunnels were narrow. Then I remembered the journal's final advice. The clever mind can turn danger into path. I spotted a narrow fissure at the far end of the cavern. It was barely wide enough for me to slip through. I sprinted toward it, ducking as the intruder's flashlights swept the chamber. Rocks tumbled behind me, making a chaotic symphony of noise. Just as I reached the fissure, one of the men lunged, but I twisted through the narrow opening, scraping my shoulder and leaving him stumbling. I was free, but only barely. On the other side, the tunnel widened into another hidden chamber, calmer and quieter. I sank to the floor, panting, with shards of diamonds still clutched in my hands. I had survived the first encounter, but I knew the intruders would not give up. This treasure was real, and now the real chase had begun. The secondary tunnel finally opened into a massive hidden cavern, unlike anything I had imagined. Stalactites dripped from the ceiling, and the walls glittered faintly as if dusted with tiny gemstones. But the floor, that was the real treasure. Scattered across the cavern were raw gems of every color: diamonds, sapphires, emeralds, and even rare crystals I had only seen in books. Some were partially embedded in stone, others lay loose, catching the light in dazzling patterns. My hands trembled as I stepped carefully among them, afraid to disturb even a single piece. I remembered the journal's last note. The brave and cautious shall find the jewels, but the greedy shall never leave. The warning made my pulse quicken. I couldn't help but wonder if the men chasing me would stop at nothing. I crouched down and picked up a larger gemstone. It was smooth, translucent, and reflected the faint light like liquid sapphire. I almost couldn't believe it was real. But before I could savor the moment, I heard it, a distant rumble. The cavern floor shook slightly beneath my feet. Rocks shifted, and small debris fell from above. The intruders weren't in the same tunnel, but something else, something unstable in this hidden chamber had been disturbed. I had found the treasure, yes, but now, the mountain itself seemed ready to challenge me. The tunnel narrowed even further, forcing me to crawl on hands and knees. Behind me, I could hear the shuffling of boots and the heavy breathing of the intruders. Every second felt like an eternity. I clutched the shard of diamond tightly, trying to ignore the adrenaline pumping through my veins. My flashlight's beam barely illuminated the jagged walls, and the echoes of footsteps grew louder with each turn. Suddenly, the tunnel opened into a small cavern. Stalactites hung low, and the floor was slick with moisture. I paused, listening. The intruders had entered the chamber too, but they were not alone. I heard whispers and movement. They were searching methodically. A plan formed in my mind. I grabbed a loose rock and tossed it down a side passage. The clatter echoed through the cavern. One of them shouted, and they ran toward the noise. My heart raced. I had a small window to escape. I crawled toward another narrow exit at the far end of the cavern. My pack snagged on a protruding stone, almost tipping me over. Then, out of nowhere, a cascade of water from a dripping stalactite splashed onto my shoulder, making me shiver. But I kept moving. Finally, I squeezed through a tiny crack and found myself in a secondary tunnel, much darker and winding. I could still hear their voices echoing behind me, but now I had the advantage. They hadn't noticed this hidden path. For the first time, I allowed myself a shaky breath. I had escaped, for now. But I knew this was far from over. I pressed myself against the cold stone wall, every muscle in my body screaming to stay still. The faint crunch of boots on gravel echoed closer, bouncing around the canyon like whispers in the dark. Whoever it was, they knew I was here. My flashlight was still in my hand, turned off. My heart hammered so loud I swore it would give me away. Through the narrow crack, I saw a shadow fall across the canyon floor. Then another. Not one person, two. I held my breath, thinking back to the journal. The old prospector had written about others chasing him, how he never managed to keep them away. Was history repeating itself? A voice broke the silence. Low, gruff, but clear. He must have gone this way. Check the wall. My chest tightened. I knew I had two options: stay hidden in the gemstone chamber and risk being cornered, or move deeper into the darkness of the cave. My gut screamed for me to go forward. I slid along the damp wall, trying not to scrape my pack, and moved deeper. The chamber narrowed into a twisting tunnel, forcing me to duck. My palms brushed against rough, wet stone, and somewhere far ahead I heard dripping water. Behind me, a sudden flash of light filled the crack. One of them had a flashlight. I heard the stones grind as someone tried to squeeze inside. Panic jolted through me. My boots slipped on wet rock, and I nearly fell, catching myself against the wall. My hand landed on something jagged, and when I looked, it wasn't just rock. It was a shard of raw diamond, half buried in the stone. Even in the darkness, it sparkled. But I had no time to marvel. The sound of someone grunting echoed closer. They were inside. And they were coming straight for me. I pushed forward, deeper into the valley, until the river bent sharply to the west. The sun was already sinking behind the peaks, and for a moment, I thought I understood the phrase in the journal. The earth swallows the sun. The light vanished into a narrow canyon ahead, and my chest tightened with anticipation. The air grew cooler, and the canyon walls pressed in tight. I could hear only the rush of water echoing off the stone. I almost missed it, but then I saw it. A crack in the canyon wall, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through. Inside, the air smelled damp, like wet stone and moss. I switched on my flashlight, and the beam landed on something that stopped me cold. The walls of the hidden chamber glittered. At first I thought it was just quartz, but when I got closer, my breath caught. Blue and green veins ran through the rock, shimmering under the light. Raw gemstones, emeralds, maybe sapphires, embedded right into the stone. My hands trembled as I reached out to touch them. I wasn't imagining this. It was real. The journal wasn't some madman's fantasy. It was a map to something incredible. But just as I felt the rush of discovery, I froze again. From outside the crack came the sound of rocks shifting, footsteps. I killed my flashlight and held my breath. They had found me. That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside the tent made me flinch, convinced those two men were creeping around my camp. I kept the journal tucked under my sleeping bag, as if holding onto it could somehow protect me. At dawn, I packed up quickly and decided to move deeper into the valley. The journal mentioned a bend in the river where the earth swallows the sun. I wasn't sure what that meant, but following the river felt safer than lingering where I'd already been spotted. The deeper I went, the wilder it became. Thick pines gave way to sharp cliffs, and the river narrowed into fast-moving rapids. At one point I nearly slipped on wet rocks and almost lost my pack to the water. My hands were scraped, my clothes damp, but I pressed on. Around midday, I came across something strange. Wedged between two boulders was an old rusted pan, the kind prospectors used for panning gold. Nearby, half buried in dirt, I found shards of broken glass bottles and the remains of a campfire. Someone had been here. Not recently, maybe decades ago, but it was proof that others had searched this place before me. As I examined the site, I noticed something that made my pulse quicken: faint carvings scratched into the boulder. Symbols. One of them was the same cluster of crystals I had seen in the journal. For the first time, I felt like I was on the right track. But I also realized something else. The men I'd met weren't just casual hikers. They knew exactly what they were looking for. And if I wanted to stay ahead of them, I'd have to move fast. The voices grew clearer as the day wore on. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I caught distinct words carried through the trees. Laughter. Male voices. At least two of them. I crouched lower by the river, my heart hammering in my chest. Whoever they were close, maybe just beyond the tree line. I remembered the journal in my bag and instinctively pulled it tighter against me. If they knew I had this, I could be in real trouble. Minutes later, two men emerged from the forest. Both carried worn backpacks, the kind seasoned hikers or prospectors might use. Their clothes were rugged, boots caked in mud. One of them wore a hat pulled low over his eyes, the other carried what looked like a small pickaxe strapped to his pack. They stopped when they noticed me. For a long, tense moment, nobody spoke. Finally, the taller man grinned. "Out here all alone?" "Brave," he said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. I forced a smile and shrugged. "Just hiking. Needed a break from the city." They exchanged a glance, then the shorter one chuckled. "Funny, we're just exploring too. Heard stories about these rivers. Some folks say there are stones worth more than gold here." I laughed nervously, pretending not to know what they meant. But deep down, I knew they were after the same thing I was. When they finally walked past me and disappeared upstream, I let out a shaky breath. But the danger was clear. I wasn't the only one chasing gems in these mountains. And if their boots had left those prints by my camp, they already knew where I slept. When I saw those footprints near my camp, my blood ran cold. They weren't mine. The pattern was different, wider, like from heavy boots. Whoever it was, they had been close, too close. The journal suddenly felt heavier in my backpack. What if someone else was after the same treasure? The thought made my stomach twist. I decided to follow the prints, at least for a short distance. They led along the river, cutting into the forest. The ground was damp, the mud still fresh. Whoever it was, they couldn't be far ahead. But after a few hundred yards, the trail disappeared into a patch of thick moss and rocks. No more tracks. Still, the feeling of being watched never left me. Every snapped twig or distant echo made me turn my head. Later that day, I returned to the river and continued panning through gravel, hoping to find another glimmer of stone. And I did, this time, a slightly larger shard, translucent, shining faintly in the sun. My excitement returned, but so did my paranoia. At one point I heard voices. Faint, carried by the wind. I froze. There were others nearby. I quickly stuffed the shard into my pocket, closed the journal, and pretended to be just another hiker by the water. But deep down, I knew This was no longer just about me and some old book. Someone else was chasing the same treasure. I sat by that river for what felt like hours, turning the tiny stone over in my palm. It was small, cloudy, but when the light hit it just right, it gleamed. My heart raced. Was it really a diamond? Or just a piece of quartz playing tricks on me? The journal offered no clear answers. Some pages were smudged, others torn, but a few scribbles hinted that prospectors in this region had once found pockets of valuable gemstones in the gravel of streams. I felt like I was standing exactly where one of those men had stood over 100 years ago. But just as my excitement grew, so did the challenges. The sun began to set behind the peaks, and with it came the cold. I hadn't planned on camping this high up, but heading back down in the dark felt dangerous. My only option was to set up a small camp near the river. That night, as I tried to fall asleep under the stars, the sounds of the wilderness kept me awake. Rustling in the trees, water rushing just a few feet away. At one point, I swore I saw a shadow moving along the opposite bank. Maybe it was just an animal, or maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. And when I woke up at dawn, I discovered fresh footprints in the mud. Armed with nothing more than the old journal, a sturdy backpack, and way too much curiosity, I set out toward the mountains early one foggy morning. The trail was narrow, carved into the side of a ridge, with pine trees looming overhead like silent guardians. I felt both nervous and excited. The journal pages kept replaying in my head, especially that strange line. Where the river bends, the earth hides what the sky once cried. After hours of hiking, I finally reached a clearing where the sound of rushing water grew louder. A river, just like in the sketches, cut through the rocks and disappeared into the valley below. Its water sparkled unnaturally in the sunlight, almost as if something glittered beneath the surface. I crouched by the riverbank, flipping open the journal. One of the crude maps pointed right here. And on the edge of the page, almost hidden under faded ink, was a tiny hand-drawn symbol that looked like a cluster of crystals. My heart skipped a beat. I dipped my hands into the icy water, scooping gravel and stones. Nothing but cold pebbles. Yet, when I turned my palm, a faint shimmer caught my eye. It was small, barely the size of a fingernail, but it sparkled like a gemstone. Could this really be it? Had I actually found the first sign? I never thought a random trip into the mountains would change my life forever. It started one chilly morning when I stumbled upon an old leather-bound journal at a flea market. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed, but inside, there were strange handwritten notes. Some described trails, others mentioned rivers and caves. But what caught my eye was a sketch of a valley, marked with an X. Underneath, written in faded ink, were the words, "Where the river bends, the earth hides what the sky once cried." It sounded poetic, almost like nonsense, but the seller insisted the notebook once belonged to a prospector from the early 1900s. He said people believed that the mountains nearby still held veins of precious stones, diamonds, sapphires, and even rare crystals, hidden deep beneath rocks and riverbeds. I laughed at first. I'm no treasure hunter. But something about that journal got under my skin. I couldn't stop thinking about it. For days I flipped through its pages, tracing the routes, studying the scribbles. Some maps looked hand-drawn, others had stains that almost looked like they were made near campfires or in caves. Finally, I couldn't resist anymore. I packed my backpack, took the journal, and decided to follow the path it described. I told no one where I was going, just that I needed a break and wanted to hike in the mountains. Little did I know, that single decision would lead me into one of the wildest, most dangerous, and most unbelievable adventures of my life.